What's up everyone, and welcome back to another 3D tips. Today what I want to talk about is actually texturing a little dragon that I have created here. So just finished modeling this little cute dragon, and I want to show you how I've unwrapped the model, because you need to unwrap the model in order to make sure that all the textures you're going to apply on this 3D model here are going to end up the way they're supposed to, without any stretching and so forth. So in order to do that, you need to take all the UVs and unwrap them as if they were on a 2D paper plane, and that way you're sure that you can texture wherever you want. The idea behind this is that you can take your model now into another software. We're not going to use Maya for this. We're going to use Substance Designer, and actually Substance Painter. It's a software developed by Algorithmic and owned now by Adobe. And we're going to use that software because we're just going to export this little model here from Maya and import it into Substance in order to be able to have the ability to actually paint directly on the 3D surface. And it has a lot of nice little tools that can help us to achieve better texturing for this model. So without further ado, let's jump into Substance Painter. And in order to do so, I'm just going to go under File and export the model here. So I'm just going to say export all, and under here I'm just going to select and say I want this to be an OBJ export. Keep everything on and just say export all. Okay, so here we are in Substance Painter, and Substance Painter is a software much like Photoshop but for 3D models. So I'm going to open my model under File, New, and just select the model, the dragon here, and I'm gonna increase the document resolution size to 2048 so I have more resolution on my texture. And I'm gonna follow this PBR metallic roughness workflow that works well when I go back into Maya to build my shader. Click OK, and what's gonna happen is I'm gonna have on the left side my model that I just exported and the corresponding UV texture on the right side. And what you can see now is I have a brush by default, and if I left click on my mouse and start painting here, what's going to happen if I hold Alt and rotate around my model, gives me the same control that I have in Maya. You can see that whatever I painted on the texture on the right side gets reflected on the model. And now the cool thing about this is that we can build and use some smart materials that are built in Substance Painter to create a much better texture right off the bat here without losing too much time. So let's try and do just that. But before we go there, I'd like to show you how to bake the textures that are necessary to do this, because what I want to do here is actually have a bunch of textures that are predefined by the software in order to recognize stuff like the curvature of the geometry and things like that. So to do this, we're going to go on to the texture settings here, and we're going to bake the mesh maps. Okay, when we say bake mesh maps, what happens is it opens all the maps that you want to bake, and we want ambient occlusion, curvature, the normal, and so on. And once we do that, it's going to go through the process of baking all of these maps, so the software knows that it needs to use them to create interesting effects with smart materials. So those are created, and you can see them here on the right side here, and we're not going to go back to them, but it's important for you to know that you need to create them before proceeding to the next step. Okay, so when we jump to the Smart Materials tab here, we're going to get a bunch of smart materials that we can use, and I want to show you just, for example, this one, the machinery. When you drop it, you would get something that's applied directly on your 3D model, but what we want to look at here is under the layers, you get a folder that gets created with a bunch of other options that are automatically created. So you have your metal base, then you have your dirt, then you have your dust as a layer on top of that, and then you have your rust. This works like in Photoshop. So if you start to remove and unclick this button, you start removing your layers all the way up until having nothing. So with the metal base, you get base color. And then if we put dirt on top of it, you start to get a little bit of dirty specks. And what happens is that it takes into account all the meshes that all the textures that we've created earlier. And it takes the curvature of your 3D model and applies it nicely, you know, on positions where dirt would initially and most probably collect on your 3D model. Then if you put the dust, it puts it also based on your map. And the important thing is that you can come in here and start, you know, playing with this. You can either play with the mask, you can play with the scale of the projection and so on. You can change the color of the dust. So if you want to, for example, change something and have it to complete different color so that it's lighter, you can do so. And that's the power. It's all procedural here, and you can change at any point the attributes of your texture. Okay, so let's try to build this texture the way that I want it, and I'm just gonna delete this here, and I got an initial layer that's right there, and what I want to do start with is I can apply a glossy plastic that has some kind of rough texture to it. Nice and interesting texture. And I'm going to enter in and modify some of the options here. So under the base, I just want to increase the roughness. You see, the more I increase the roughness, the less reflective it is, the more I decrease. And then it gets to be more reflective because you can actually see the environment. If you hold shift and right mouse button, you can rotate your HDRI map and kind of like see how the lighting behaves. So I just want to create this so it's a bit, let's say, not as reflective. So it has a bit of reflection, but not too much. So when we start moving things around, we can see that, you know, it reflects, but not too much. And that's my base. So from there, I'm going to keep the grunge. I'm going to keep the dust that's there and move on to the next stage. So from there, what I'm going to create is another smart material. I have a smart material that I've saved from before, and if I apply it here, this is what I get. It's a nice material where I went in and I put a little bit of a leather texture and painted over the eyes and some areas here of the dragon to create some interest. And I'm just going to show you here a part that I want removed. For example, this instance here. So when we open the smart material, you would see that I have a bunch of. So I've got my leather pattern here, and what I want to do is find the layer that's corresponding here, layer 3. And you see this layer 3 here has some other textures that I like to keep, but I don't want this area here. So just want to show you how you can quickly remove that. You have an eraser tool here right under your brush. And once you're on your layer that's selected here, you can just paint this part out. And that way you get to keep what you like about this texture. and remove the parts that you don't really want to keep this interior here, mouth. Just gonna remove. You can always double click on any of the layers and rename them to whatever you want. For example, additional decals, for example. Okay, and somehow I'm happy with the result here, but what happens if I'd like to paint, let's say, this area so it's completely different, and so that it looks a bit white and, let's say, plasticky, and a bit of a part on the wings here to get a little bit of whiteness and some kind of different look to it. So I'm going to search under smart materials. I'm going to type plastic. And there's, for example, this plastic dirty material. I'm just going to drop it here. And what you see is what happens is that your entire model gets painted in this new smart material. And we don't want that. We want to keep also everything that we painted and created up until now. So this is where the masks come in. And you can add by right-clicking on your mouse here, let's say a black mask. And now you see that I get to see the material that I created before underneath. And now what I want to do is, while this mask is still selected, I just want to, paint out the plastic parts that I want to see. By using open and close brackets, you can make your brush bigger or smaller, depending on what you need. Now I'm starting to slowly reveal parts of the texture that I want to show. And this is where things get really interesting with Substance Painter, is that you can now, for example, change your brush type and create something that's much more interesting around these edges. So how can we do that? Well, we're going to go under the brush properties, and we're going to go on the next tab here, the alpha, because each of the brushes that you have contain an alpha shape, and then you can change the alpha shape that you want to use to paint, right? And I'm going to take something a bit more like that's something that's a bit more dirty, and you can see that now when you hover around your 3D model, your brush is completely different. And then if you start clicking and painting, you can see you achieve some different result that you would get initially with the soft brush. And then you can start to paint in a bit more of these details and something that looks slightly more organic when you look at from further away. Because remember, in my final shot, when I start rendering, I'm never going to be this close to the model. I'm just going to be somewhere around here. And you see it creates a little bit of more of an organic look to my model. And I'm just going to go through painting everything that I need here so that you guys can see how it looks when this is done. So I'm gonna keep on continue painting here this area. So for now I've painted all of these bones that are coming out, let's say, and now I'm just going to add a bit more detail around the wing area so that it creates a bit more visual interest when you're looking at the wings of the dragon. Obviously, you can spend a bit more time, you know, detailing all of this. I'm just going rather quickly in order to show you guys how to go through the process of texturing some of your models. You can spend way more time refining those areas. Same thing on the other side. I'm not going to mirror anything, so you know, I believe that it's always better for you to hand paint whatever you're painting, because it gives it a little bit of an offset, a little bit of a difference than actually mirroring everything so that it looks the same. And you know, so that way it feels and it looks a little bit more organic. So here's a part that I've missed. Close the bracket down like so, and let's say I'm happy with these wings here. Okay. I'm pretty much happy with this. On to the next step. So I think for now it all looks good. I just want to create a little bit more of a feeling that the dragon's been around and that he's been burnt or something, you know, like, so I want to create something as you know, like a bit of a grungy or more old texture, or something that gives him a bit more of a feeling that he's lived a long and prosperous life. So out of these smart materials here, there is this leather seat, old and dirty. So if I drag and drop this one here, I get something that looks like this, and you can see what I'm talking about. So these little more details here, you know, and then it's using the curvature map to shade a bit of the inner areas of the mouth. And then if we look at around the wings here, it's creating a little bit of an interesting offset with the skin, and it adds a different kind of layer here that's gonna contrast with the skin, the leather material, that smart material that we have. So I'm gonna open up the folder here and see what we've got. So we've got the dust. And if I toggle it on and off, you can see what happens. The leather worn, I'm going to keep that. And then we have the base. And if I remove the base color, or even I can hit delete on my keyboard and delete it because I don't really need it, then this folder allows to have the transparency below, and I see my material, which actually makes it look way more interesting this way than without it. You can clearly see that it adds some kind of life overall to the entire dragon. Even the parts that we hand painted are now, check this out, getting this layer on top, some additional texturing. And this is the power of Substance Painter, is that you can layer on a bunch of these procedural smart materials or even regular materials, and then paint stuff out and add stuff, you know, and it keeps on adding life to your model. And to finish this off, what I'd like to do for this dragon here is to create some dots and specks on his body, and maybe even some details around here. And how we're going to do that, where we're going to create a new fill layer, or actually no, we're not going to create a fill layer, we're going to create a paint layer. So I just clicked on paint layer here to add the layer, and then what you can see is if I select my brush here, I can start to paint parts that could be like spots on the body of the dragon. So I'm going to create some that are smaller, some that are bigger, you know, just to create some interest to the overall, look and feel of the dragon. And to obviously make the dragon a little bit cuter, so he doesn't look menacing. And if you start adding those small spots, that's exactly what you get. A little dragon that looks way less menacing. Obviously, if you want to change colors, you can do so here under the base color. And let's say you can select a bit of a more off-white. So some of the spots are not exactly the same color. That's fine as well. That could be an interesting thing to do. All right. I'm just going to continue and add a bit more spots here on the legs, just to create something that extends a little bit beyond just the back. And I open and close the brackets to change the brush size. All right. So I'm going to call this specs. Left click on the layer and rename it specs. And I'm just going to create one more, not fill layer. I'm just going to create one more paint layer. And here I'd like to create something that's going to look like this, you know, like so that the dragon has kind of an interesting shapes. I guess that's what dragons have under their body to protect them from cold and fire and other threats they might find throughout their journey into their respective magical realms. And you can always take the eraser and then the eraser brush and then adjust according to what you need. Let's come and repaint this like this. Okay, on to detailing this. Okay, on to detailing this further. Okay, so how can we detail this further? Well, I'd like to have a little bit of, you know, like height, or actually, you know, to have a little bit of a bump here on each of these decals here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll down, and underneath my material properties here, you see there is one option that's called height. And then when you increase this to be in the white area, now you can start painting height. And this is what we're exactly interested in. We want to bring this forward so that when you look at it, it has a little bit of a height to it. You know, when you look at it from a distance, you change the light, it's not just a flat texture, but it actually has a bit more depth. That's exactly what we want. So we're gonna paint that on all of those here to get a little bit more detail. It's always better if you can paint your details like this rather than actually having to model all of this, because your model is not as heavy and it's gonna be easier to control it later on when we're rigging, and less skinning to be done, and so on and so forth. We're gonna paint all of this in. Okay, and this is where we're at. So there are some parts of the height here that are maybe too much. You can always use the eraser brush and reduce the size of your brush with the open and close brackets on your keyboard. There we go. Pretty happy with this now. Control, actually I'm holding shift and left mouse button to change the lighting to see how the model looks in different conditions, lighting conditions. Okay, I'm pretty happy with this. So once you're done with this, this is the part where you can export your model, and let's go back into Maya and see how it looks. But before we do that, we need to go under File, Export Textures. We're gonna put the configuration as it is, so it's going to be PBR metal rough. It's fine. You can change that, and you can change the configuration if you want to something else here. So for example, in my case, I'm using Redshift to render, so you can select Redshift as a configuration. Select the material you want to export. This is the advanced configuration if you want to play with it. And we're going to select our output path. Okay, so here we're back in Maya, and now what I want to do is I want to switch off the wireframe on shaded, select my model, and then right click, say assign material, and I'm going to put a redshift shader, redshift material. And in there, in the color, I'm going to pipe in a 2D texture, the one that says diffuse from the exported materials that I have. And if I click 6 on my keyboard, I would now see how the texture is applied on the model the same way as in Substance Painter. Now to make this look good, we need to input a couple of more maps here. Number one, we're gonna change the BRDF of the shader onto GGX and put the Fresnel type on metalness. It makes the shader react better to the reflective parts. And then under the roughness, we're gonna put what's labeled roughness. And under the metalness, we're gonna take the one that's called metallic. Okay, and finally, we're gonna go under the tab called overall, and under bump map, we're gonna put another 2D texture. And this one is going to be the normal map. All right, and now if we go under Redshift and click IPR, what happens is that we get a live preview of the model and how it looks. And this pretty much concludes the 3D tips about how to export your model into Substance Painter and texture your model and bring it back into Maya and have a nice looking dragon that's ready to get rigged and animated. If you have any questions, don't forget to ask in the comments below, and of course like this video if you find it helpful, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching and see you soon.